and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Ahrens, and today we'll be looking at a subject which is always difficult to define, especially when it comes to actual performance. In traditional works, it is usually the case that we as pianists attempt to control every aspect of the piece so that in performance, everything makes sense to an audience. We can foreshadow an event that comes later, we can guide our audience through difficult harmonic transitions, and we can point out to them structural issues which may be unusual or unexpected. All of this is done using things like specific voicing techniques, rubato and tempo alterations, and of course dynamics and articulation. But what happens when the piece doesn't really work in a fashion that allows us to explain something unusual before it happens? In other words, what happens when you don't play the piece, but the piece plays you? Consider the final movement from Schumann's Fantasie, Opus 17. I'll play the first large section so you can get an idea of what I'm referring to when it comes to surprises that are not telegraphed in advance. In order to talk about surprises, it's necessary to talk about what is expected. At the beginning, Schumann follows tradition in establishing the key reasonably early. However, he does so in a non-conventional way. We still have the traditional 4 to 5 to 1 cadence. But how Schumann gets to the 4 chord is very unusual. C major to A major to F major. This is interesting because much of the pop music we hear today relies on the historically more conventional progression, which would have C major move to A minor, not A major. This would lead to F major, and then G major, and then back to C. Schumann's decision to take us to A major, albeit briefly, is already something that is not expected, especially because A major and C major are quite far off from each other. Some notes are common to both keys, but important notes, like the C and the G, are offset by a semitone. There's no way around it. Though small, this is an unexpected progression. Before we delve into more unusual progressions, let's take a brief moment to look at other places where conventional harmonic situations occur. Bar 30 to 34 develops naturally. Then, the build-up from bar 60, though again slightly unusual in terms of the progressions, still leads with conviction to a resolution in F major. In these cases, it's quite easy to let the audience know, using the conventional tools such as dynamics and voicing, where we are harmonically and where we are going. In other words, there's little doubt how the music is developing. Why is this important to note? When we talk about interpretation and performance skill, what we're really talking about is the ability of the performer to understand how the music is constructed, what tools the composer is using in order to express change, and then translate all this knowledge into something the audience can hear with clarity. Poor performances are not only due to technical inaccuracy, not at all. Sometimes you will hear a note-perfect performance in which the music still doesn't make much sense. The concept of music making sense is really just about the performer communicating the construction of the music without the audience sensing the construction consciously. It's not about the audience thinking, well, that cadence resolved nicely, but more about them thinking, that section has come to an end, but it feels like there's more music to come. Furthermore, music can be made to make sense to an audience based on how we as performers set up the internal logic of the piece. We give the audience clues to what is happening, and their own feelings and intellect put it all together. But we'll talk more about this later. Just keep it in mind. Let's look at a situation where Schumann changes direction without warning. Our opening establishes the key of C major. But from here on out, Schumann simply drifts from key to key, without any seeming intention of locking the structure and tonality down. Consider, the first two bars move in a lovely progression. But then we jump to another completely unrelated key right after. How is this possible, and how is this okay? Well, we have no choice actually. It must be made to be okay. What makes it all the more interesting is that he ends up at the same chord the second time, only he takes more time and a more convoluted way to get there. Between each of these little sectors, we have stark transitions that are not prepared or explained. They simply happen, and we have to find a way to make them make sense to the ears of the audience. A little later on in the piece, we have the same problem, really. Schumann sets up a situation using a predictable progression, but then goes off the rails entirely and leaves us wondering where he's headed. So far so good, but then he changes keys without any preparation or subtlety. He repeats the process, and because we've heard this kind of extreme shift before, in a sense, the second time is prepared for our tender ears. This goes on and on. The section from bar 44, though beautiful, has no real tonic at all, and it just moves from place to place without much regard for our mental safety. sense of this, not only for the audience, but for ourselves as well. Well, this is where things become difficult for those studying Schumann. Predictability in music allows us to perceive when things are the same and when things change. Change of any sort requires a frame of reference to be built. Without this frame, change has no meaning of any kind. To understand the structure and communicate it efficiently requires a set of assumptions built into the piece, but also expected of the audience's ears. There are certain universal experiences that we can always rely upon. For instance, the beginning of something is always a point of complete uncertainty. If a musical idea is repeated, then we can assume that it is important and may perhaps change. All of these things happen in run-of-the-mill classical pieces, and it usually doesn't pose a problem to communicate. What Schumann is doing here is removing bits of the framework upon which a reference can be made. By shifting keys so directly, he's not giving us a chance to compare elements. This has significant ramifications to how we portray the music to our audience. The first option that we have in making sense of this kind of music is to simply force it to conform to the structural requirements. As an example, we could keep the rubato to a minimum and play the opening chords in tempo except when marked otherwise. In addition to this, changes in sound production could coincide with changes in large sections rather than individual key changes or chords. These two transitions are perfect examples. In terms of dealing with harmonic volatility, a structural approach tends to gloss over these changes, simply breezing through them without acknowledging them in favor of pointing out the big transition points. This option works to an extent, but in my view it represents perhaps the first of many steps in making this music work. In terms of predictability, we still have a few problems, however, with this approach. For example, the key shifts that happen can sound very sudden and out of place if we do nothing with them. Even though they are structurally relevant only as transitions, they seem to require more than just a nod of the head. Even the smallest shifts require something. what we do, this sounds surprising to the audience, and there's no way we can prepare them for it. If we do nothing, then the audience hears this and wonders, what in the world just happened? And in a worst-case scenario, that didn't make sense. The failure of using a structural-only approach lies in the assumption that structural landmarks in the piece do not require additional preparation by the pianist. Normally, this assumption is not a problem. Composers enlarge the note values towards cadences, they make the gestures perhaps larger towards the end of something, and usually a key center is established and reinforced so that as listeners, we can hear that an end is coming. With transitions, composers may repeat gestures and rhythms in order that the listener can take those elements for granted and focus their ears on the harmonic shifts, for example. Continuous sound is the nature of traditional transitions. If a piece is composed using these tactics, then the pianist doesn't have to do anything in order for the structure to be clear to an audience. They can hear it because of the already built-in clues. In this piece of Schumann, and to be honest, in many others by him, it appears necessary that the pianist must amplify, and sometimes invent, sonic effects in order to help the audience perceive the piece better. With a structural approach, we miss a great many details. If we were to take the opposite approach, where we highlight every small change in harmony, gesture, and rhythm, then we get something which almost seems like there's too much emotion in it. Furthermore, with the requirements of ritardando written into the score, we're liable to grind to a halt in some places. Now, this isn't necessarily wrong, as we're now providing enough time and space for the harmonic elements to make sense to a first-time listener. But the overall structure is obliterated, and it can sound as if we're simply improvising at random until we stumble upon the key we want to be in. There are lots of beautiful moments, but they don't seem to be related to anything before or after them. Do you see my point? For a moment, let's discuss what I'm actually doing with regards to extreme exaggeration. First off, every change in voicing or melodic location is of interest. As an example, the suspension in bar 4 is highlighted with extra time and sound quality. The change from bar 14 to 15 is another example, only we really shift the sound quality in an extreme way to signify to the audience that something has changed. In addition to exaggerating harmonic events, we also can highlight new musical ideas that occur in the piece, almost celebrating them. In bar 23, the left hand starts a new idea. The right hand mimics this, and the idea runs for a while. We could highlight this area again with time and sound color. Even changes between two reasonably similar phrases can be exaggerated. The first time we hear the tune in bar 44, it is relatively simple, but the repetition is different by voicing and declaration. We can exaggerate this kind of change. Notice that here we're actually preparing these surprises by giving time before them and after, so that they are easily digested by a listener. The exaggeration takes on other forms as well. On the large scale, each change in basic harmony can be characterized by a different color of sound. For example, in the section starting in bar 30, we have a kind of stability in A flat major, so let's give it a rather warm color. The change to F major can be a little colder and more transparent due to the register. And finally, the G minor section can be cold as ice. Small-scale harmonic events can be highlighted using the same technique. In the opening transitions, each section can have its own sound quality and atmosphere. These changes in sound, once again, soften the surprise element and make it seem more like we knew it was coming. But no matter what, we're still clouding or obscuring the structure, which doesn't help the audience grasp where things are going in the big picture. If we think about it, these kinds of extreme changes do not really sound out of place if the piece was written by Liszt or even Chopin to a small degree. We'd almost expect this kind of change. We'd expect stylistically to focus on the moment and not on the overall structure like we would in a Mozart sonata. And this is a fantasy, after all, so it's certainly not inappropriate. But this is the real difficulty of Schumann. He can give us a traditional overall structure without the preparation that is usually inherent to that structure inside, which means that we actually have to balance both elements of large-scale structure and small moments of glory. If we prepare a surprise and give the audience time to listen to it, we bend and break the timing structure. If we focus on structure, we can't prepare the surprise. This is very, very tough, and this is why this piece is difficult. This is also why I describe it as Schumann playing the pianist instead of the pianist playing Schumann. No matter how hard we try, we cannot impose a traditional structural approach to the performance because Schumann forces us to acknowledge unprepared events that seem to be outside of this traditional approach. We simply can't ignore the surprises that Schumann presents us with because they are too extreme to be played over. Ultimately, it's about choice. We have to choose what elements we want to bring out that are structural and what surprises we want to highlight and prepare. We can't do both all the time, so it's a compromise of sorts. I'll now play the other half of the piece, and I want you to listen out for all the things I'm talking about. Prepared and unprepared surprises, large structural moments, and small moments that are almost separated from the whole. The piece drives the performance, and not the other way round. With Schumann, we cannot totally enforce our own expectations, but we must find a way to incorporate the unique and sometimes inexplicable choices Schumann makes with the conventional elements he always provides. It's a balance, and if you can get it right, then the audience will definitely thank you for it. So, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing, and never forget that sometimes we have to give up our total authority in interpretation and simply let the piece play us. Bye for now.